They say Rome was the height of civilization: marble temples, golden coins, and the power to conquer the known world. But behind the polished statues and grand speeches lay secrets Rome never wanted written in stone. They say Rome was the height of civilization: marble temples, golden coins, and the power to conquer the known world. But behind the polished statues and grand speeches lay secrets Rome never wanted written in stone. Whispers of rituals so depraved, so horrifying, that even Roman historians struggled to describe them. These weren't tales of love or passion. They were stories of control, humiliation, and blood disguised as worship. Behind closed doors, senators and emperors gathered in shadows, their power sealed not only with laws and armies, but with rituals that blurred the line between the sacred and the profane. Every torchlit ceremony was both a display of dominance and a warning. In Rome, the body itself could be enslaved by fear. Tonight, we descend into the hidden chambers of ancient Rome to uncover the most horrifying sexual rituals ever recorded. Rituals that turn desire into punishment and worship into terror. To understand these rituals, you must first understand Rome itself. Rome was obsessed with power over land, over wealth, and most of all, over people. Sex was not simply pleasure. It was a weapon, a tool of dominance. In the temples, in the palaces, even in the marketplaces, acts that we today might call unspeakable were paraded openly. For the Romans, to humiliate someone sexually was to strip them of honor. And in a world where reputation was life itself, there was no deeper wound. This was a society built on hierarchy. Every gesture, every word, every relationship was tied to power. A senator could use scandal as a blade sharper than any sword. A general could silence a rival not by killing him, but by shaming him before the people. And shame in Rome was worse than death. Death ended a life, but shame destroyed a name, and a Roman's name was meant to outlive him. It was carved in stone, written in records, and passed down through generations. To stain it was to curse his descendants as well. So when sex was turned into a public display of control, it was never about desire, it was about dominance. It was about reminding the people who ruled and who obeyed. Even the gods were drawn into this struggle. Temples held not only offerings of gold and incense, but ceremonies meant to display the submission of mortals to divine will. And yet often those divine rituals were little more than the fantasies of powerful men, cloaked in the language of worship. Rome's obsession with power reached into the body, into the soul, into the most private corners of life. And once power claimed those places, nothing was sacred anymore. The cult of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, was said to hold midnight ceremonies deep in the forests. Romans whispered that these feasts began with music, laughter, and endless wine. But as the moon rose higher, the rituals descended into chaos. Clothing torn, torches blazing, and men and women thrown into wild frenzies that often ended in violence. Drums echoed through the trees, the sound carrying for miles, so that even villagers far from the gatherings spoke of them with trembling voices. It was said that during these nights, ordinary citizens, farmers, slaves, even senators' sons and daughters could lose themselves completely. No rank, no title, no law remained. For a few hours, Bacchus ruled Rome, and all that mattered was surrender to frenzy. But that surrender came at a price. In the confusion of the night, rivalries erupted, betrayals were born, and blood was spilled. Some called it worship, others called it madness, yet all agreed it was dangerous. The Senate itself once tried to ban these gatherings, calling them a threat to Rome's order. Not because they doubted their existence, but because the rituals pushed the limits of human morality. They feared what could happen if thousands lost themselves in the name of a god who thrived on chaos. Still, whispers say the cult lived on in secret. In hidden groves and candlelit chambers, the followers of Bacchus continued their ceremonies, believing that ecstasy was the only path to true freedom, and that through wine, song, and frenzy, the boundary between man and God could be broken. And perhaps this was the true fear of Bacchus' feasts. Not the drinking, not the frenzy, not even the blood, but the terrifying idea that in those nights, Rome itself dissolved. Masters and slaves, nobles and peasants, men and women all became equals before the god of ecstasy. And in a society built entirely on control, there was no greater threat than freedom, even if it lasted only until dawn. The Vestal virgins were sworn to chastity, serving as sacred keepers of Rome's eternal flame. Chosen as young girls, they were separated from their families and bound by a vow that lasted 30 years. For 3 decades, their every movement was watched, their lives belonging not to themselves, but to the goddess Vesta and the city of Rome. But what if one broke her vow? The punishment was not a simple execution. A Vestal found guilty was led in silence through the city, veiled so that no one could meet her eyes. Crowds gathered, yet no cheers were heard, only the heavy silence of fear, for all Romans knew her fate. She was taken to an underground chamber, carved beneath the earth, where no sunlight could ever reach. The priests offered her a bed, a lamp, a little food and water, not as mercy, but as ritual. For Rome believed that spilling her blood would curse the city, and so her death had to be delivered indirectly. Once inside, the stone door was sealed. The sound of it closing was said to echo like thunder, the final reminder that her life had ended, though her heart still beat. Alone in the darkness, she would wait. The lamp's flame would flicker until oil was gone. Her food would dwindle. Her voice would fade into silence, unheard by the world above. Romans called it justice. They said the eternal flame of Vesta had to remain pure, and if a guardian failed, her life was the price demanded. But others whispered that this was not just punishment, it was fear made visible. For if even the most sacred women in Rome could be erased, then no one was truly safe. Her sin was erased in the most brutal way possible, and yet her absence haunted the empire. The people feared the silence she left behind more than the scandal of her crime. For beneath Rome's grandeur lay the truth. Its gods demanded loyalty not only in worship, but in suffering. In the private halls of emperors, ritual and cruelty blurred into spectacle. Lavish marble tables were set not for celebration, but for domination. Emperors like Caligula were infamous for turning banquets into arenas of humiliation, where every detail was staged to remind the guests of their inferiority. Guests were summoned not to dine but to obey. Golden cups overflowed with wine, yet no one dared to drink until the emperor raised his own. Those who resisted his will found themselves stripped of dignity, mocked by courtiers, and broken before the court. For the emperor, it was not lust, it was dominance, the sheer pleasure of bending others to his will. Every laugh, every gasp from the crowd was another reminder. The emperor's power extended beyond the battlefield, into the most intimate corners of life. To humiliate a noble was to show that titles meant nothing. To break a guest in front of hundreds was to prove that Rome itself bowed to one man's desires. And as the night dragged on, the line between ritual, cruelty, and entertainment vanished. For those present, survival meant silence, because even a glance of disapproval could turn the emperor's gaze upon you. Saturnalia was Rome's grand festival of reversal. For 1 week each winter, the city drowned in noise, wine, and endless games. Slaves became masters, and masters became slaves, or at least that was the idea. Masks hid faces, dice rolled freely, and the usual laws of order seemed to vanish. But behind the laughter and feasting, Saturnalia often turned dark. Masters demanded humiliating acts from their slaves in the name of role reversal. What began as playful mockery could descend into cruelty, as those in power used the festival as an excuse to indulge their darker impulses. Banquet halls echoed with laughter, but not all of it was joyful. Some slaves, forced into charades of authority, knew the game would end with punishment. Others, humiliated before crowds, carried the scars long after the festival fires burned out. And when the revelry ended, the chains of reality returned heavier than before. The roles were reversed only for show. Power itself never truly changed hands. For the slaves, Saturnalia was not freedom. It was a cruel performance, a reminder of their place. What was celebrated as liberty was, in truth, a sharpened lesson in control. The empire could tease them with illusion, only to snatch it away, leaving silence, bitterness, and fear behind. In certain temples, offerings were not coins or animals. They were bodies. Sacred prostitution was practiced under the guise of worship rituals where women and men were offered to strangers in honor of the gods. To the priests, it was devotion. To the participants, it was duty. But to many who looked on, it was exploitation wrapped in holy robes. Some said the gods demanded union, that through these acts the divine and mortal worlds could be joined. Others whispered that it was little more than greed, A way for temples to profit from the desires of men while claiming it was sacred ritual. Imagine walking into a temple not of silence and prayer, but of smoke, incense, and hushed transactions. The air was heavy with the mingling of perfume and sweat, while statues of marble gods looked down with lifeless eyes. For the devout, it was believed to be a cleansing of spirit. For the unwilling, it was humiliation etched into the name of faith. Rome blurred the line between religion and exploitation, binding faith to desire and desire to power. And once again, those with wealth and status dictated the terms of worship, while the powerless paid the price in silence. What was called holy left scars that were anything but divine. So what do we make of these stories? Were they all true? Or were some exaggerated by Rome's enemies, designed to stain the empire's legacy? Perhaps a little of both, for Rome was never simple. It was an empire of contradictions where beauty and brutality walked hand in hand, where a single city could give the world aqueducts, law, and philosophy, and yet at the same time whisper of rituals that even their own historians struggled to write down. But one truth remains: in Rome, sex was never just sex. It was politics, it was power, it was humiliation, domination, and control. And often it was horror wrapped in marble and myth. So next time you admire a Roman statue or wander through the ruins of their grand cities, pause for a moment. Imagine the shadows that once lingered there. The echoes of voices, the scent of incense, the weight of secrets never meant to survive. Because the same empire that shaped Western civilization, that built roads stretching across continents, also carried within it practices so dark they still make us shudder centuries later. And that is Rome's truest legacy. Not only the monuments of stone, but the hidden stories carved in silence. If you want more forbidden stories buried in history, subscribe and join me for the next descent into the shadows of the past.